Museum for this great lecture here tonight. I'm thrilled to see so many people here for this and taking part in some of the new exhibits we've had downstairs, and we're thrilled to have such a great turnout for such a good speaker here this evening. I want to thank first the Loudoun County Public Libraries, and Lorraine in particular, for being a huge help making this happen and co-hosting this event with us, and other events that we've had recently as well. It's great to work so closely with the Loudoun County Public Libraries. I also want to thank the Black History Committee with the Balls Library, as when we were trying to think of different speakers and ideas to help support the exhibit downstairs, tremendous help in reaching out and getting different ideas and different types of lectures we might be able to hold. So thank you to Donna and Steve Hammond for eventually making the connection with Ric Murphy and making this possible. So I'd actually like to ask Steve if you would actually please introduce Ric and the speaker.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. Well, again, let me add my welcome to you all this evening. I'm excited to be here. I want to also welcome Joe to our community here in terms of him providing new leadership to the museum here, and I think that's a great shot in the arm for all of us, and we look forward to having more programs like this in the future. As he mentioned, I'm a member of the Black History Committee. There are several of us in the room here today. The chairperson is Donna Bohannon, who is here in the front. We work hard at trying to help bring Black history to light in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's in the background, trying to provide research and background about the things that we're doing, and other times it's trying to be more in the forefront with bringing great speakers like my friend Ric Murphy here. So if you have questions about the Black History Committee or are unfamiliar with it, please pull me aside afterwards or get with Donna or one of the other members, and we'd be happy to chat with you about the kinds of things that we're doing. Ric and I met a couple of years ago, probably 2.5 years ago. We were actually in Arlington, and we were talking about Arlington National Cemetery. He was beginning to do some research, or maybe in the middle of some research, where he was going to be writing a book on Section 27. And if you're familiar with Section 27, it's an area where Black Civil War soldiers were buried, as well as freedmen that were part of the Freedmen's Village. And so we got into a conversation about how my extended family, my ancestors, the Syphax family of Arlington, perhaps intersected with a lot of the work that he was doing. And so we became good friends, and he ultimately convinced me that I should become a member of the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage, which is really a way that we can recognize ancestors that we can trace back that were enslaved. And so I thank him for getting me involved with that. So we've become closer and closer friends. We kind of cross on the speaking circuit. But the thing about Ric Murphy is, I don't know if you have a pencil and paper here, but you're going to want to take notes. This guy he's got so much information. You're going to enjoy this, I'm sure, because the things that he has to share and the work that he does as an author and an awarded author for that matter, I think will really kind of show in the presentation tonight. So I hope you enjoy it. I know that he has a lot of good stuff to share, and with that I'll bring on my friend Ric Murphy.
Hello, Loudoun County. Hello. It is so fortunate that Mother Nature worked out for us this evening. It brought the rain and the cool weather. I was so afraid that the room would be so hot that everyone would be sweating, waiting for me to finish. So now instead of taking an hour, I'll feel free to take 2 or 3 hours because they're nice and cool and not in a rush to go outside. Again, I also want to thank Joe and the Loudoun County Museum for the invitation. Lorraine, thank you for supporting this. And the Black History group, thank you so much again for making me part of this honor as well. This is an honor. This is a very important year in African American history. And part of what I'm going to talk about is how it all started. I don't know anyone's political persuasion here, so I will have a little humor here and there. So it's not intended to be political, but it's intended to kind of move the discussion along a little bit. And I think it's really important for us to understand that what took place in 1619 is very relevant today in 2019. Now, I am the National Vice President for history for the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. I wear an awful lot of hats. I wear too many hats. So part of my doing this around the country is in conjunction with my activities with the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. And we like working in partnership with organizations such as the Loudoun Museum and the Loudoun Public Library. So this really fits well with what we do and how we do it. And it really shows a good collaboration between us and local communities and stuff we do on the national level. So what I'm going to talk about today is the path to 1619, the arrival of the first documented Africans in English North America. Now, there are a lot of different opinions as to who these men and women are. So I'll put that right up front, that there's a lot of controversy about who these people are. And one, I found out that I am descended from two of them. So how lucky could anyone be to find out that they are descended from two of the first documented Africans in English North America going back to 1619. So if someone tells me to go home, I'm happy because I'm originally from Boston, and my mother's people and my father's people are from here, from Virginia, it's in the 1600s, so I feel right at home here. So thank you about that. Now, in talking about the story of America's first Africans, I'm writing a book, so I have done extensive research on these folks. And a lot of the research, people tell me, is pretty groundbreaking. And the book should have been, my publisher is not happy with me because the book should have been out last year so we could celebrate 1619. But every time I'm getting ready to turn it in, something new pops up. So I'm more concerned about getting it right than getting it out early. So one of the publishers now said, well, let's do two versions now so we can work on, so we'll see what happens. But the 400th, I'm having a little problems with this here. The 400th Commemoration, this is kind of what Virginia looked like in 1619. But our understanding of Virginia is very interesting. It's a false narrative. And most of us don't understand that false narrative, and I will discuss that with you. But it's important to understand that it was a false narrative because you'll begin to understand the history of these first documented Africans very much flows from a false narrative. So those of you who are in the private sector or who are in government, you go to these fancy workshops and they're always talking about a paradigm shift. We're going to get you to think about things differently. We want you to look at the world differently. Well, this really is about a paradigm shift because to understand the historical importance of these first documented Africans, you need to have a paradigm shift. Now, I'm going to start the paradigm shift a little bit differently this evening. And I'm going to talk about DNA. Now, we're all hearing about DNA. I'm sure many of you have done the swab in your mouth or done the spit in the little jar to find out what your DNA is because you want to find out about your own genealogical background and your ancestry and what have you. And the DNA is a very interesting thing because it really helps facilitate a discussion of immigration. Now, we're hearing a lot about immigration today in politics, but when we do our DNA, that's not what we're thinking about. We want to know how much French we are, how much Italian we are, how much Irish we are, how much... Now, some folks say African we are. Well, it's not really African. It's Bantu. It's some of the tribes in Africa because they are kingdoms just like the kingdoms of Europe were many years ago. Now, on this discussion of immigration, there was a White House meeting about a year ago, and according to reports in the newspaper, somebody said, why aren't we having all of these people from ESCO countries come here? There was a meaning within that. And that meaning was that people who come from those countries are not as good as people who come from other countries. That was followed up with another story where that person reportedly said, widely reported in the newspapers, why the government wasn't doing more to recruit people from Norway into this country. So there's a perception here that people from Norway were more important than people from ESCO countries. So I'm an asshole because that's where my people are from. But something very interesting here, and we're going to start talking about paradigm shift, because in 2015, the Migration Policy Institute did a study. And what they found in this study was very, very interesting, that 39% of those from the sub-Sahara who were immigrants had college degrees, bachelor's degrees, compared to only 29% of other foreign born, and compared to 31% of US born. They were more educated. Who would have thought? 75% of them were in the civilian labor force, compared to 66 for other foreign born, 62 Native American born. You kind of get the story that the history is that these folks who were coming here from sub-Sahara, according to widely studied reports, are more educated, better trained, better jobs than those who were coming from other places and even those who were born here. History repeats itself. And that really is the story about the 20 and odd Africans. The first recorded Africans in English North America, which is present-day United States. So we're going to start the paradigm shift. Now, history, they were recorded as 20 and odd. Now, they didn't use the word Africans, they used the N-word. But we now realize the federal government borrowed that word about 6 years ago, but the Spanish really used that word to describe skin color, not a group of people. So we now refer to them as the 20 and odd Africans. But more important than that, we know where they came from. So I actually know where my ancestors came from. They came from Cabasa, Angola. When they left Angola, they were enslaved. They were to arrive in Veracruz, New Spain, which is present-day Mexico, and they were to be enslaved. But something happened in the middle that changed all of that. And that's what we're going to talk about. Slavery would not be their fate. Interesting enough. Now, this is a story about globalization, colonization, integration, and propagation. And I'm going to peel each of those away to help you understand as to who these 20 and odd are. Now, I must say that this group of people, these Angolans, were very, very different than the other masses of Africans who came here. So we should not combine them as the totality. Now, globalization, you know what Webster says it is, and I don't really need to read it, but it's the process by which businesses or other organizations develop international influence. Now, this story actually starts in, and we learned it in history, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Now, there was a reason why Columbus sailed. They were trying to find routes to the Far East. That's what it was all about. But much like family, the Iberian Peninsula was shared by two great kingdoms, the two powerful kingdoms at the time, the Spanish and the Portuguese. And much like family, they didn't get along. So they both were trying to find routes to the Far East that had been blocked off to them. So whether the world was flat and they could go around or around, whatever, they were trying to find a way to get there. And everywhere they went, they were bumping into each other. And when they bumped into each other, they realized that they were discovering new lands and new people, and they wanted to colonize. So when they wanted to colonize, they would colonize under the Pope to Christianize the land, and that was to give them the rights to those lands. But something began to happen. They kept bumping into each other, and they were trying to colonize the same lands. So they were ready to go to war. And everyone knew that these two powerful nations going to war was not a good idea. So they needed an arbitrator. And guess who the arbitrator was? The arbitrator divided the world in half and said, Spain, you have this. Portugal, you have that. And what this great arbitrator did, who by the way was the Pope, he came up with the Treaty of Tordesillas, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. So he divided the world in half. So Portugal got east of this line, and Spain got west of this line. Now, someone always raises their hand and say, well, Brazil is Portuguese, but the rest of South America was Spanish. Makes sense. But it depends on how the Pope divided the world, and as you can see, those were the lines of how the Pope divided the world in half. So you can now begin to understand how Portugal believed they owned everything in Africa. That's why the Portuguese were so influential in Africa, because the Pope told them, you own the land and everything there. Now, this is a very important thing to remember, because it really will begin to help you understand who these Angolans are when they came here. Is this blocking the view? When they came here. So let's talk about the Bantu Empire. Now, those of you who are Americans of African descent, and you notice I didn't say African Americans. Those of you who are Americans of African descent, and if you did your DNA, if you have Bantu, that means you're descended from these. I got all kinds of Bantu in me, which helps me to understand that I'm descended from these folks. But the Portuguese discovered the Bantu empires in the 15th and 16th centuries. They found that it was an extremely advanced civilization in Africa. It embraced Christianity. It embraced international trade. It sent students abroad to study in Europe, brought back technological advancements, and traded in slaves, the Middle Passage. Now, I'm from Boston, and going to college, it was not unusual to see students from Africa come to Boston to go to any one of the schools. I thought that was a new phenomenon. Had no idea that that had been going on since the 1400s. Now, how do we know this? I'm going to tell you momentarily. But let's talk a little bit about the Middle Passage first. And I can do a whole presentation of the Middle Passage, but I'm going to truncate it in 5 seconds. The historical significance was that it was the transatlantic slave trade, and it was the largest movement of people in world history. It lasted approximately from 1545 to 1860, 315 years. Over 12 million people were kidnapped and forcibly taken from Africa. Only 10 million made it, reached their port of call. More than 15% of the human cargo was lost to history. But you know what's really interesting? Of the 44 million Americans of African descent, according to the last census, came from only 350,000 to 400,000 people. That's all. Not only that, there's another 20 million Americans of European descent that also now find out that they have Bantu blood in them, which I'll explain a little bit later on. So this kind of helps us understand a little bit about colonization. According to Webster, the act or process of settling, moving, and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. And that's what the Portuguese did in Angola. Now, Angola originally was part of the Congo Kingdom. Now, the discoverer of Congo and Angola, his name was Diego Caio. Now, we know so much about this because he actually wrote all of these letters back to Spain. And these letters are found today in the Spanish archives. So this isn't something that's made up. It actually comes from 1400, 1500 documentation in the Spanish and Portuguese archives. When he discovered it, he said it was considered one of the greatest kingdoms of Central Africa. It covered more than 115,000 square miles with 4 million people. The kingdom was founded much like the royal kingdoms of Europe through the consolidation of power through military conquest. The Bantu people lived in some of the most influential and powerful kingdoms in equatorial West Africa. The people were an advanced, permanently settled, farming, herding, who forged iron tools, weapons, and who lived in the same towns year-round. Now, I don't know about you, but I was shocked to learn that. And I don't know about you, but do you remember your first introduction to Africans? I remember mine. I was a little kid. I was watching Tarzan. developed communities. I didn't know that they knew anything about clothing. All I saw was grass skirts and bones in their noses and swords in their hands. Paradigm shift. When he wrote back to Spain, he said that the language was highly developed. They lived in urban communities. They were skilled in working metals, including iron and copper. They were skilled potterers. They were skilled in weaving mats and articles of clothing. They domesticated animals. And I want to repeat that again because I really want that to sink in. They domesticated animals. And they were skilled in using farming tools. This was in 1493, not 2019. The king was assisted by a central administrative body. They had a capital with a palace, with a police chief. They had a high priest. They had provincial governors. The king made his favorite sons governors. They had a strong base to contest secession. And the governors nominated lesser lords. This was a highly structured community. Who would have thought? Now, what happened was, when these Portuguese went there, the king was so impressed with them, he had to figure out what made them different. And the only thing he could think of was their religion. So he wanted to become Catholic. So he became baptized along with 6 of his chiefs who all took Portuguese names. Remember that. They took Portuguese names. This began a long history of diplomatic and religious exchange programs between the two nations. Between 1493 and the early 1600s, in Congo and Angola, it became a Christian state. But not just a Christian state, they became Catholic. And what happened is when they sent the missionaries over, the lords sent their sons back to Europe, to Spain, to Portugal, and England, and to Rome, to learn and study. And they brought that back to Africa. Who would have thought? The king's immersion into Christianity so impressed the Pope, he called him my beloved son, according to the records in the Vatican. The Pope in 1518 named Alfonso's son Henry the first bishop of Black Africa, 1518. Now, why is that important? The Catholic Church had a bishop in Africa before it had it in Europe, because that was the Protestant Reformation. But that came with a price, because as the Portuguese sent stuff to Angola, it wanted stuff in return. They wanted ivory, it wanted gold, and it wanted slaves to pay for the expenses. Now, I want to shift from the Bantu Kingdom, and I want to talk about Jamestown. Founded in 1607, it was a peninsula on a swamp. The colony was owned by the London Company. It was owned by the London Company. Jamestown did not start by the government of England. It was a company-owned town. Those of you who are from Detroit or any government-owned town, you know what that means. That they believe that they own everybody and own the people, much like the Portuguese believed that they owned everything in Africa. For the first 20 years, Jamestown experiment was a failure. Those of you who are students of Jamestown, I'm quite sure you're well aware of the starving period in 1609, 1610, when they resorted to cannibalism and wiped out almost all the women. It was not a good place. I can tell when I'm getting too heavy, I gotta add a little lemon here. Things were so bad in Jamestown that they couldn't recruit people to go there. There was high attrition, atrocities by the local tribesmen, famine, disease, and poor management. The majority of the men who came from England were from the peasant class. They were poor, uneducated. Many of them were orphaned and homeless, and many had commuted prison sentences. They worked for the London Company. Those who were here, every time a ship came back, 2/3 had died. That's how nobody wanted to come here. They had to provide an incentive program during those first 20 years to bring people here. Now, this is about the time when people begin to question things that I'm saying. So, I want to give you a date, November 20, 1622. That was after the introduction of the first Angolas. There was a list of 60 men and women. Alice Whitwood was one. She was at the Bristol prison, convicted for killing an infant. Because of the infection which the prisons are infected, they said that they wanted to send them to America. They wanted to clean the prisons in Europe and send them to America, because that was the only way they could fill up the boats. Because if they couldn't fit their quota in sending people over, they found ways to do that. Peter Wilson Colvin. Now, those of you who are genealogists are very familiar with him. I'll tell you a little bit about that book momentarily. July 23rd, there was an actual plan to empty the prisons of 3,000 poor people and give each man 20 acres, a house, and the necessary supplies so as to empty the prisons. That was after the introduction of the first Angolans. So you can begin to see the need of how they had to recruit people to come to the colony. And why was that important? Because the first 20 years, they were broke. Not one single plantation made a profit until the discovery of tobacco. And the problem with tobacco, for those of you who come from tobacco country, you know after 2 years the land is no longer any good. So you have to constantly till over new land, cut new trees, till new land, so you can have more space to plant more crops. Now, I want to do something. The plan to empty the prisons is in a book called The Complete Book of Immigrants, 1661 to 1699. Now, this is by Peter Wilson Colvin. Now, he writes a lot of the primary source materials that people use to do their reference work. That was on page 33, if anybody questions as to where it came from. But we'll come back to it in a little moment. Now, the Juan Bautista, that was the ship that brought those first documented Africans here. Very interesting about that. The Portuguese and the Angolans went along for a couple of hundred years until the missionaries found something out. That the capital city of Cabasa was sitting on top of a silver mine. A silver mine. So for 5 years, Portugal went to war with the Angolans and did not win. Until they sent 36 ships, I keep saying I fix it, 35. They sent 36 ships loaded with soldiers and a lot of money to hire African mercenaries to take control of the royal city Cabasa. And when they did that, in January 1619, they took the smartest, the wealthiest, the leaders out first. And they put it on a ship called the Juan Bautista. Now, Juan Bautista was, you know how, everything we have is made in China? Well, the Juan Bautista was made in Japan. It was an actual ship that was made in Japan because the Japanese in the 1615s were thinking of becoming Christians. They built a Spanish-style ship. 3 years later, they said it's not worth it, and they sold the ship to Spain as part of the Spanish Armada, and they renamed it the Juan Bautista. It became a slaver, and the captain of that slaver was under contract. How do we know that? Oh, this captain has a long archival record of every everything that happened on this ship, and I'll explain to you momentarily. 350 men, women, and children were placed on the San Juan Bautista. Now, they're the ones that eventually arrived in Point Comfort. Now, what happened was, when the San Juan Bautista was out in the Atlantic Ocean, these people had never been on a ship before. Over 100 people died within weeks. The ship was forced to stop in Jamaica. And they needed food and medicine, and they needed to wash the ship down. How do we know this? Because Captain Acuna wrote a large record on that. Because he had no choice, because he had to train 24 young boys for the food and medicine. They leave. So they leave, and on July 15th, a couple days ago, 400 years ago, the ship was 500 miles off the coast of New Spain, present-day Mexico, off the coast of Yucatan Peninsula. Now, this was the peak pirating season because it was after the spring hurricane season, before the fall hurricane season, and this is when all of these ships are leaving South America, Central America, to take their gold and silver to Spain. So all of the pirate ships are just waiting for them. And 2 English pirate ships, one called the White Lion, the other one called the Treasurer, they see this very big, clumsy ship low in the water. And on July 15th, when the captain looks behind him in the San Juan Bautista, he sees all these clouds coming in, but he also sees these 2 pirate ships behind him. For 2 hours, they fought. The San Juan Bautista was badly damaged, so wasn't the Treasurer. And when the English finally board the San Juan Bautista, they realized what was on that ship before they got on the ship. You know how they knew? The smell. But they thought that there was gold hidden underneath them, and that was a disguise. And when they realized that there was nothing more than enslaved men, women, and children, and they weren't leaving Veracruz, they were to arrive at Veracruz, they took the 60 healthiest men, women, and children. Indenture. When you bind someone by an indenture as an apprentice or a laborer, which is very different than a person being enslaved, someone who is the legal property of another and forced to obey them. These first Angolans that came, if you really look closely at the colonial records, you'll find that they weren't slaves, you'll find that they were indentured. Because if they were slaved, they never would have been free. Now, what's interesting about these men and women, Anthony Johnson and his wife Maria owned 2,000 acres of land. I don't know of any slave that could have done that. Juan Pedro became a martyr when they had the wars between Virginia and Maryland over Catholicism. He was one of those that was killed in 1653 and became a Catholic martyr. John Gowen, who I descend from, had the rights to indenture his child and became the first African to indenture his child for 20 years, and he did that to make sure that at the age of 20, he would be a free man. And that's what they all began to do, was to indenture their children to make sure they did not become enslaved. So there was a clear distinction between an indentured servant and an enslaved person, because an enslaved person is like skin color. It never changes, and it goes on from generation to generation. Now, I mentioned earlier about how the Portuguese had converted the kingdom of Congo and Angola and the Spanish names. Well, you know what's really interesting? If you look at the 1623 census of Virginia, and the 1624 and 65 census of Virginia, I can't understand why people today say we don't know who those Africans were. Because you know what you'll find in the census? Spanish names of Margarita, Juan, Pedro, Catholic names. And you'll begin to find from some of those very early documents that they understood English because they were entering into contracts. Who would have thought? So it really was a false narrative that these Africans, because of the color of their skin. Now, I had to tell Steve something. I said, Steve, I don't really remember if I put this in my presentation or not, but I went someplace 3 weeks ago, and I listened to a presentation about these first documented Africans. And, my grandmother was from the South, and whenever she would get angry with somebody, she was African American, but when she got angry with someone from Boston because she thought they were little, she would say, "You're a Yankee." So I don't want you to come across and say, "I'm a Yankee," but I was a little disturbed when I heard 3 weeks ago someone say that they knew the Africans were enslaved because their skin was black, dirty, so they had to be slaves. And that the English were not slaves because their skin was white and pure, so they couldn't have been slaves. Now, this isn't something that was said in the 16, 17, 18, 19. This was said 3 weeks ago at a historical institution here in Virginia. Shame on us. Now, the story about these Africans are hiding in plain sight. Well, I don't really think they're hiding in plain sight, which I'll show you momentarily. But there are 5 distinct clues about these first Africans. They had the legal capacity to bind a contract and indenture one's child. Now, what slave do you know indentures their child? They have no rights over their children. They had the independent legal capacity to consent to being used by another as a head right. They had the legal capacity to bind a contract to buy or lease land. They owned their own animals. They branded their own animals, and they sold their own animals. And they had the legal right to bind someone as a head right. Now, I want to make sure you understand what a head right is and what that means. Now, a head right, again, I mentioned earlier on that they couldn't bring people over here, so they found incentives. So they said to anyone, every man, woman, and child you bring here, every head you bring to America, you have a right of 50 acres of land. Head right. So if you bring somebody here, you have a head right of 50 acres of land. So most of these captains who had ships and they brought people over, and they were the ones that owned the land, when they brought people over, that's how they got 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20,000 acres of land, because every head they brought over, they had a right. But you want to know this last point, that the Angolans had the independent legal capacity to bind a contract and indenture another as a head right to obtain land back. Do you know how Anthony Johnson got his 2,000 acres of land? He paid for white Englishmen to come here as head rights. How do we know that? It's in the colonial records. And where did he get his money from? Because the poor peasants who came here came from urban environments. They knew nothing about animal husbandry. They knew nothing about farming. They barely knew how to use a saw to cut down a tree. These Angolans had been doing that their entire lives, and they became cattlemen. And the reason the brands were important is because they branded their animals, they sold them, used the money, and brought, because it was cheaper to bring somebody here than to buy the land, and that's how they get their head rights. And I'll show you where this stuff is found shortly. Clues were hiding in plain sight. Legal capacity, consent to use, head right, capacity to bind a contract. This was all under British common law. And that's how everything was done. So as I mentioned to you, head right was a legal grant to land settlers in the colonies. The first recorded Africans, again, these folks were unique. They weren't like all the other Africans who came here, so they're very, very unique. So you've got to keep them in the back of your mind. They came at a time when the colony or the called British common law. There came a time when contract law provided from the London Company. And as I mentioned, the 50 acres of land, and that's how most of them acquired their wealth. Now, I know someone's going to ask me, or someone's going to say, and quite frankly, I wouldn't blame you. But this is all found in the court transcripts located in any of the libraries here in Virginia. You just have to know which books to find it. Those of you who are familiar with the colonial books, you'll find them in Kingsbury, different court decisions. You'll find them in the original records. They provide a very clear understanding of the intellectual capacities of these Africans. You know what also is interesting? That the shipping captains, who were the oligarchs of the colony, only did business with each other. They didn't do business with the peasant class. There was a reason for that. But there's one group of people who they did do business with, because they deemed these Africans as their equals. Who would have thought? Because they needed animals, and who do you think knew how to grow the tobacco? Now, much of this is found in primary sources. So, I mean, the skeptics are in the office, in the audience, and you're going to say, where? You'll find it in all this stuff here. You'll find it in the papers in the Royal Archives in London. You'll find it in Heading. You'll find it in Houghton. You'll find it in Kingsbury. You'll find it in the minutes of the Council General Court records. They're there. Who knew? Now, we have a misperception of who these Africans are because John Camden Houghton, now those of you who belong to the Jamestown Society, the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, yada, 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 all these very prestigious societies, you get your documentation from a book called The Original List of Persons of Quality. Because after all of these descendants came from people of quality. But you know something really interesting? You really need to look at the subtitle. And it is within these subtitles that you get a real good understanding of who these people were, white and black, English and Angolan. Coleman is another one. He has a list of everyone who came here. Immigrants in chains. And as I said earlier, when they couldn't fill a boat up, they captured people off the streets in England. They went to Ireland and enslaved many of the Irish and some of the Scotch. Now, integration, the development of culture that draws on diverse traditions rather than merely bringing a racial minority group into the majority culture. You know what integration is. In fact, we're kind of talking about it today in the news. But the 20-odd Africans, when they first came here, they were separated and dispersed throughout the colony. They didn't live in segregated communities. They lived throughout the colony. They saw the Virginia colony divided up into 8 different counties. And it is within these county records that you find those court transcripts, the legal documents. That's where you find all of these individual documents. Propagation. Webster, the breeding of specimens by natural process from the parent stock. And you know what's very interesting? I give this talk in very large venues with thousands of people, and the majority of the people in the room are African and Americans of African descent. And paradigm shift. Even for them, it's hard to kind of grasp this. But you know what's interesting? When I start to show the next slide, they all of a sudden begin to understand. And what the next slide does, it begins to show you who the free Africans were. And within 100 years, there were 500 distinct African families who were free. And most of them have English names. And the reason they have English names is because when those poor children came over, who did they live with? They lived with the slave families. And they integrated with those same families, and they began to have families. So when you start to see these names in the 1620s and the 1630s, you'll begin to find many names that African Americans have today because they descended from those very first families whose mothers might have been white, their fathers might have been white, and they integrated with those families. They became the 500 free African families to the mid-1700s. Who would have thought? Now, there was a gentleman by the name of Dr. Paul Hyde, a European American, married an African American of African descent. And whenever he would go to her family reunions, he could not understand how everybody in the town, everybody in the county, everybody in the next 5 counties were all related to one another. He couldn't understand that. And they could sit there and explain how they were related to one another because they had been doing these reunions, but more important, they had been passing this history on for years and years and years. So he decided, as a professor up in Maryland, recently retired, to grab a bunch of college kids, graduate students. They went through all of these counties, and they went through all of the colonial records that some of you question whether or not they actually exist. And he found these names in all of the colonial records, and what did he do? He came up with a 2-version book with all of these names. Now, I'm an author, and as an author, I should never say don't buy another author's book. And shame on me for saying that. Do not buy Paul's books. They're very, very expensive. They're like $59, $60 each. Paul was such a good man and realized what it was that he was doing for African American genealogical and historical research. He posted his books online and downloaded them up online for everyone to be able to use. That's a picture you want to take if you're doing African American genealogical research. Not only does he have the names up there for skeptics, he has every single citation as to where he found the documentation, and he did the actual genealogies. Who would have thought? So when I say that this is a paradigm shift, this is a very truncated presentation. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about how they enslaved some of the children. There was a book that came out that did documentation on the children who came from England between 1660 and 1720. And more than 5,000 white children were bound into slavery in Maryland and Virginia. They have their names, they have the ships that they came on. And some of those children, their parents came and found them and took them back. And they have the resources to do that. They were kidnapped from Ireland, Scotland, England. Some of them even stolen from New England, and they went there to drop off things. There was an actual law in 1659, English law, justice of the peace, could kidnap children found vagrant and ship them to any foreign colony or plantation. So they made it legal to do it. Now, for those who are Americans of African descent, and those who are Europeans who found out that they also are of African descent, the question always comes up, how is it possible that I could be related to these Africans? Now, if you're on Ancestry like me, I have something like 1,500 fourth cousins. I go on 23andMe, I think I get close to 2,000 fourth cousins. How is that possible? Now, we know that we have 2 parents, we have 4 grandparents, and so forth and so on. And if you go back to the 1600s, 14, 15, 16 generations, depending on the age differential, you've got approximately 32,768 people major. And that's what this would look like. But there weren't that many people here in the colony at the time. So this is what it really looks like a diamond. So the further you go down, the closer it becomes. And that's one of the reasons why those of us who are African Americans, we can go back 4 or 5 generations and say we're cousins. My grandmother on my father's side would say, where are you people from? And she wanted to make sure that none of us married a cousin. And my grandmother on my mother's side would say, who are you people? Because it had significance to it. So when I do my DNA and look at Ancestry.com, what did you say when you saw me?
You look like my uncle.
It's amazing. Now, what happened was, these particular Angolans were unique. And as they progressed economically, the laws began to change and were chipped away. In 1662, they changed the law that the child took the status of the mother and not the father. Things changed. In 1676, English began to come here. They began to take over land that didn't belong to them. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to move and eradicate all of the indigenous people. And the indigenous people started to fight back. And there was a gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Bacon who started a rebellion because the wealthy captains took virgin land and they sold land that was not any good to grow stuff on because it had already been stripped by the tobacco to the poor white Englishmen. A rebellion happened. And while the beginning of the rebellion dealt with defeating the Native Americans and literally building a wall across northern Virginia, where Richmond is, the poor whites and poor blacks banded together because it became the poor against the rich oligarchs. Indentured versus freemen. Land poor versus land gentry. They attacked the government. And they actually burned down Jamestown to the ground. After it was all over, the land gentry got upset over the lines between the white and the black because there were too many Africans in the colony at that point in time. It became the turning point on race relations. They now developed laws to prevent any African of acquiring the wealth of those original Angolans. They developed a racial caste system. Again, we talked about how these whites and blacks were intermarrying with each other. They actually passed laws against that. They passed laws preventing whites from freeing blacks or mulattoes. They actually reduced the number of white indentures that came, and they started with the slave laws. Now, I want to give you a specific example. I mentioned Anthony Johnson. He came here in 1619, and when he died in 1670, you know what happened to his land? They told him he couldn't give it to his son because he was an alien. And the people who sat on the jury, not one of them were born here. It shows you how the laws changed. So every accomplishment these Africans made, if you go to the 1705 slave codes, their accomplishment and then the slave codes prevent any other African to be able to accomplish the same thing. Who would have thought? So the slave codes for a series of laws enacted by the colony regulating activities between the slaves and the citizens of Virginia. And those codes directly correlate to the accomplishments of those first documented Africans. Now, I think that's all that one can take on a beautiful evening like today. Steve mentioned I'm working on a book called Section 27. You all have a very wealth of resource in Steve Hammond. The Syphax family is just absolutely considered one of black royalty as far as the black community is concerned. Steve's a phenomenal resource. 1619 is the research I've done for this, and what I went over is just the tip of the iceberg of what I found. Cuffy's Lane is about the American Revolution in the first major battle in Saratoga. And I had two ancestors who fought in a decisive battle, and the general in England actually commented on how great they were. I'm descended from them. So this is passionate for me because in doing my research, I find my family. So this is not theoretical. This is something that's personal. It's something that's passionate. I think you can see how I talk about it, how it's passionate. If you want to keep up with me, you can find me at ricmurphy.com. I'm on Facebook. And most of all, thank you for your kind invitation. Now, I would not have done my job if I didn't create a lot of questions for you all to ask. So the only way I'm going to know that I did a good job is for you all to challenge me on some questions. Yes, sir.
So, for so many African Americans, it's really difficult to do research beyond 1870. So how did you get, how did you get to understand and know that in 1619 your ancestors?
I'm going to answer it two ways. I'm going to try to be short. The family became memorial in a location in Montezuma. Now, in my family, all four grandparents were very competitive with each other. Meaning, my grandmother, my grandfather, my grandmother, my grandfather. And we would always get together for holidays. And whoever would talk about their family, the other one had to outdo that person. So as children, we had heard these stories all along. Now, I didn't like history because what I learned in the family is not what I learned in the history books. And coming from New England, which is a big revolutionary city, we were told that we had ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War. But I learned in school that that was impossible. We were slaves. So when we got involved in this very big land dispute, we were told that we needed to do a family pedigree. And one way of doing a family pedigree is to join a lineage society. And I was young and foolish and didn't realize that lineage societies take 2 years. So I decided to do my mother's pedigree to a Revolutionary War soldier, and without realizing it at the time, was during a big lawsuit with the Daughters of the American Revolution. And the issue was, any DAR members here? And usually a couple of hands go up. When I tell the story, the bells go up. And what happened was, they froze all of the documentation at the DAR because most of these women had not really proven that they descended from a Revolutionary War patriot. Set my mother's application down, usually takes 2 years. Within weeks, we get a call back. Now, living in Massachusetts was most fortunate because Massachusetts collected birth, death, and marriage certificates going back to the 1600s. So I had all of the documentation. And old foolish me, when I paid for the actual certificate for something like 30 people, attached it to the application. It went to the registrar in Massachusetts. She approved it within days, as she could go right down and see, sent it. Within 30 days, my mother's application had been approved because it was the first application, unbeknownst to us, under this new process where everyone had to prove it. Now, that really got me into genealogy. Now, my grandmother and grandfather, on both sides, said we have aunts and uncles who are still living. So I interviewed them in my early 20s. I didn't know what I was doing, but they told me to interview them. That they have stories to tell. I wrote it down. I kept pictures. My grandmother, on my mother's side, knew her grandmother, and her maiden name was Gowen. Had no meaning to me at all. When I moved down here, I started going to the DAR library, and I started doing more and more research. And lo and behold, what I found, which goes to your question, African Americans from the South, we don't have birth, death, and marriage certificates, but what we have is land records. And I found the Gowen land records. And I went back another generation, and what those land records did is they actually provided a pedigree, because when someone died, they said who was related to and how. So I kept going back, and back. In 1742, the family left Virginia, moved to North Carolina, Granville, North Carolina, and my direct ancestor bought 1,000 acres of land, and the man who signed the deed was Lord Granville himself. Had no meaning to me. But he said he sold his land in Brunswick County, Virginia, so I went to Brunswick County, Virginia, and lo and behold, it took me all the way back to John Gowen, 1619. By pure accident. Now, what I tell folks is the way we as Americans of African descent do our genealogical research is wrong. We hit that blank wall and we stop. And we're only looking for grandma's last name and grandpa's last name. But you remember how I showed you all those ancestors? You have to find the family names and go from there back. Many of us who come from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, think that we came off the boat and that's where we were. But when you do your DNA, you begin to find out that you have ancestors in Maryland and Virginia. And what happened was that they were sold south. Because in the early 1800s, they could make more money in selling a single African American than an entire summer's crop. And that's why we were sold south. So now everybody's joining these lineage societies because they're breaking that code. So they're looking at those Paul-Heineck names. And when they see those names, they're now trying to figure out how am I related to that person, because we are all related going back 4 or 5 cousins. That's all. So when you hit that blank wall in 1890 or 1870 census, skip it. Find the names and look for where your people came from, because that's where you're going to find them. Yes, sir.
Can you explain how white children being kidnapped are recognized as slaves, but black people being kidnapped have indentured servitude?
Different time periods, and that's why it's really important to remember that these first documented Angolans were different than the remainder because they lived in a different time under English common law before Virginia started putting in its own laws. When the white children were kidnapped, the gentleman who did that book, the reason why he knows so much about them is because they went to the courthouses of Virginia, the courthouses of the counties, and they sued for their freedom when they got to be 21, 22, 24, 25, in the 30s. They sued for their freedom. And that's why there's a record of how they came here, how they were enslaved. Because the law was, if you're an indentured servant, you should only serve 7 years. If you are a minor, you can serve up until you're age 20, or a woman, age of 30. And they started suing, and that's how they won their freedom. So it didn't just happen. Now, many of them escaped to the courthouses.
If I might
Follow up, go ahead.
The fact that they sued for their freedom doesn't necessarily state that they were slaves, because if one just simply disagrees with the length of the term, then those Africans from Angola could have sued for their freedom. And by that
Many of them
definition,
did. Some of the Angolans did, but,
Well,
let's go back to
slaves.
let's go back to the whites. They actually used those terms. I was treated like a slave. I was stolen from my parents. So the same thing that happened to the Africans where they were stolen, you will see that verbiage in the actual colonial records.
so then they say they're slaves?
Yeah, many of them said I was treated like a slave or I was a slave. Those were those words. Now, the original Angolans, many of them also sued for their freedom. And I mentioned how in 1656, when the law changed that the child had to take the status of the mother, Elizabeth Key, her father was a wealthy Englishman, white. Her mother was an African woman. They don't say what her status was. Her father died. They refused to give her her inheritance. She sued. She won. Her lawyer became her husband. Her white English lawyer became her husband. And the moment she won her case is when they passed the law that the child takes the status of the mother, which meant that no African child would ever be able to take their father's white inheritance. So she did sue. And there were quite a few cases where they sued. These again were smart folks.
I understand, but simply because someone disagrees with their term of indentured servitude and they sue for their freedom makes them an indentured servant. The same name is being applied unequally, I think.
No, once they sued, they didn't sue to become an indentured servant.
They sued to be free.
They sued to become free, and they became free, and that's how they then went out and started buying their own land, buying their own animals, leasing land, and growing their own crops and selling them.
So if a child is enslaved and sues for his freedom, how does he or she reach the enslavement part? Because the indentured servant can simply sue for his freedom.
The enslaved were not able to sue for the law. John Gowen, my ancestor, his second son was indentured, should have been freed at the age of 20.
Right.
So he was indentured.
Now we get somewhere. Right.
The man who had the indenture treated him as a slave and said he was a slave for life. So he wanted to convert that indenture to enslavement. And Philip Gowen sued, and the court recognized him and made him a free man. So he was treated as a slave.
So the children are simply indentured longer.
Yes, a child, right. A child was indentured longer than an adult, yes.
So they're
But
not
those
slaves.
children, some of those Angolan children who were indentured,
Just the white children. I'm talking about just the white children.
well, even the white children sued for their freedom.
Right, but they're not enslaved. They simply have a longer indentured servitude than the
All right.
adults.
We can talk, I want other folks to ask a question, but I kind of think I made the point, but we can go out. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
So I want to go back to the Paul, is it Hennig?
Paul Hynek, yes.
Hennig?
Hynek.
Okay. I've seen his books. I've found names of my family in the books, in the book or a particular volume, the Virginia volume. But now I haven't seen it in a year, and I only saw it one time. But I wondered, based on, I saw the Gowans and the Goins in the book, how do people use those books? How are they, like if I see Sarah Collins had a child by an enslaved person.
Is Collins one of your family names?
It is,
That's a free name. That's a free family.
yes, and Barber, Collins and Barber. But seeing them in the book, I saw the paragraph, I saw the phrase, but I didn't know how to use it after that.
Now, I told you that one grandmother would say one thing and another grandmother would say another thing. And my family tends to come to things late. So I had a cousin who just tiptoed in here late. So it was his grandmother and my grandmother. It was his grandmother and my grandmother would say, "Who are your people?" They would say, "Who are your people? Who are your people?"
Yes.
Now, what you want, you know that you are descended from the colonists. My other grandmother would say, "Where are your people from?" Now, are your people from that area? Or where the Collins family's from?
Hyde County, this is North Carolina.
So that's where your people are from.
Yes,
So those are your people.
yes.
So now what you've got to do is you use Paul Hynek's book. He gives you the roadmap of what colonial records to look for. Look at the land records, because your family probably is living in the same place that they have for the last 300 or 400 years. Many of those families have not moved. Now, if you find a family that's moved, make sure that the county line didn't move around them. Because the Collins family goes back so far that that land that they're sitting on today probably has been in 3 or 4 different counties because it's been renamed. Now, interesting how I can say that and agree with you. So now, so what you want to do is you want to go back to those records and go as far as you can to present day. And then once you've done that, you go back again and you'll make those connections. Because Paul Hynek, he does his work up into the mid-1800s.
Yes.
So what he did purposely is he left a generation out during the Civil War until the War of 1870. So now all you got to do is you make that connection between 1850 and 1870, and you should be able to make those family connections. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Just curious, you mentioned Angola quite a few times. What was unique about Angola as most countries send their children back to England to get education? What about the Angola kingdom that made them unique and have the opportunity to do this, that?
It was a wealthy. They were into trade. When the Portuguese went there, they started to trade with the Portuguese. It was a very developed area. Much of Western Africa was developed. Again, I mentioned how my first introduction to Africa was Tanzania, and we all thought that these folks were kind of a primitive third world people, as we would say today. They were far more advanced than we realized, but certainly when the explorers went there and they wrote all this stuff up, I'm using their words, not my words. And these wealthy people understood the value of who these Europeans were, so they put in place an exchange program. So when the missionaries went to Angola, they swapped to have their sons go over there to study. So it was an exchange program. And each generation, because again, this happened for 200 years, each generation kept becoming smarter and smarter and smarter. So when these Angolans came English, and they were Catholic, who could read the Bible, and the poor English peasants couldn't read or write or compute. And that was during the Protestant Reformation. Most of them had no familiarity with the Bible. So these people actually were unique who came here in 1619. So these particular Africans were everything about them was unique. So we can't make a generalization that those that came 100 or 200 years after them were like them. These particular ones were so unique. They spoke multiple languages.
And they're the ones that cultivated tobacco in Africa.
The men were, in Angola, the men were the herders. And if you remember, I said that they knew how to domesticate animals.
Right.
The women were into the farming. And they were the ones who knew how to grow the tobacco. And again, you'll find that in the colonial records. They were the men. They were the ones who went into the woods and brought back the herbs for medicine. So when you look at these colonial records, not one single plantation made a profit until an Angolan went on that plantation.
And those were the ones that captured the other tribes in England, Africa, that made it such a powerful kingdom, as you say.
That's correct.
Then the English also passed along ones where Someone tried to legitimize slavery, say English, the English were culture red, to say that there was no liberty in slavery in England, so they outlawed slavery or training slaves in England. And this case was taken to the highest court in the country.
Lord Mansfield.
Before,
Lord Mansfield.
that's my Lord Mansfield, that's
Right, 1742.
That's right.
And many say that was the maybe 1752. And that was the cause for the South to become part of the American Revolution because they were afraid that England was going to come here and free the slaves.
That's right. That's Mansfield.
Lord Mansfield,
Lord Mansfield.
who, by the way, had an interracial grandniece, Liddy. And many of us have seen her picture and never knew what the picture was. And there was two granddaughters, one white, one black. Liddy was standing up and looked like she had fruit on her head. She was the wealthy one of the two. And there was a movie about her a couple of years ago called Belle.
Very good.
How many saw the movie?
I saw it 2 times.
Yes, ma'am.
I do have, so you said that of the ship of Angolans.
Same Juan Bautista.
Yeah. 22 were traded, 22 men were
24 boys.
24 boys in Jamaica, but then the pirates captured. So do you know what happened to those that were captured by the pirates?
They were the ones that were brought to Virginia.
Oh, okay.
They were brought to Virginia.
So the others.
So the second piece of the story, and I'll be very, very brief. When they were brought to Virginia, now I told you that the captain of the San Juan Bautista his name was Acuna. He was under contract to bring 350 Africans to Mexico, Veracruz, New Spain. 100 died, 24 he traded, he lost 60 came to Virginia. When he went to Mexico, he wrote everything up that happened to him. And everything that he happened to him turned into a major international crisis. I said that these Angolans, that slavery would not be their fate. The reason why it would not be their fate, because England and Spain just came out of the 14-year war. England was bankrupt from the war. King James did not want another war with Spain. Anyone from North Carolina? What's the capital of North Carolina? Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh was beheaded because he engaged in piracy, and King James wanted to make an example of him. None of you all engage in piracy or you will be beheaded. When these Englishmen pirated the San Juan Bautista, they brought the Angolans back. And they were very, very nervous when they brought them back because they knew they were in trouble even before they came here. Because the captain of the San Juan Bautista's last name was Acuna. And they knew that when word got back to King James that he would be gunning for them. Because the ambassador of Spain, Ambassador Sotomayor, went to King of James and said, we will go to war over those Africans. Now, why did he do that? Because his real name was Acuna, and he was first cousin to the captain of the San Juan Bautista. And they were afraid that the Spanish Armada would come up the York River and blow up the city, and that's why they did not become enslaved. Yes, ma'am.
So,
And Joe's giving me that slow stand and yes, ma'am.
okay, last one. At that time, were the slaves on the ship, were they insured? Because most of them were insured in coming across the ocean.
During that period of time, they were not insured. He lost his fortune on what happened at the San Juan Bautista. The ship was so badly damaged, they left it in the ocean. And the Japanese actually came back and got it themselves. So you can go online right now and you can see a replica of the San Juan Bautista. Now this is a replica. So the ship came back, they broke it up, but they used the specification, but no, they were not insured. He lost his money, and that's why his cousin, Ambassador Sotomayor, went to back in England. There were all kinds of investigations. The Privy Council went to Bermuda to investigate. went to Jamaica to investigate, came here to investigate, and all of those records, and there's a wealth of information on these Africans because of the investigation that took place, because the ambassador of Spain threatened to go to war with England over these 60 Angolans. So you can see why they were so special. International war. I want to thank you all again. Joe?